They stopped screaming before the ship left shore, because screaming helps when someone wants ransom. It does nothing when you've been taken as cargo. Salt water, splintered wrists, a prayer cut short, and the women who vanished after Lindisfarne learned one truth before Europe did. The Vikings had not come only for gold, they had come for bodies. But that isn't even the darkest part. The darkest part is this: we can still count the relics that were stolen, yet the women themselves almost disappear from the record. Who were they? How many were taken? And what did survival look like once the monastery was behind them and the North Sea was ahead? June 793. Holy Island, a strip of stone and prayer off the coast of Northumbria. Low tide turned it into a road. High tide turned it into a sanctuary. That illusion mattered. At Lindisfarne, men copied gospels under candlelight. Bells ruled the day, and the bones of St. Cuthbert made the island feel untouchable, protected, chosen. But holiness is a terrible defense against men who row towards silver. The morning did not begin with thunder. It began small, mist over the water, cold wind off the sea, a gull cutting across the silence, then shapes, long low shadows where there should have been nothing. A monk squints toward the surf. Another hears shouting in a language he doesn't know. Then the first figure jumps into the shallows with an axe already raised. No warning, no declaration, no battle line, just impact. A hand opening in the sand, a bell rung too late. The chroniclers tell us what the raiders did to the church: plunder and slaughter. They tell us priests bled on sacred ground and the sanctuary was stripped bare. What they do not give us is the comfort of full accounting. No neat list of every victim, no reliable inventory of every captive. That silence matters because silence is where the most vulnerable disappear. So let's not romanticize this. When armed men storm an undefended religious site, they do not move like tourists inside a cathedral. They move like hunters inside a pen. Some kill resistance fast, some tear open storerooms, some seize what can be carried. And if people are there young, healthy, frightened, isolated people become part of the loot. What is more valuable than silver that can spend itself only once? A captive who can be sold again and again. That is the part medieval sources often blur. Treasure is described, saints are mourned, kings are shamed. But human beings taken alive slip into one word: captives. And inside that word is a universe of terror. Because death at least ends in one place. Captivity keeps moving. Onto a beach, into a ship, across a sea, into a household where your name is the first thing to die. Did Lindisfarne hold women that day? Almost certainly women lived, worked, prayed, or sought refuge in and around the religious community. But the exact number so often repeated online is not securely documented in the primary sources. That is one of the competitor video's biggest weaknesses, its self-certainty where the evidence is thin. The stronger story is also the truer one: some people were killed immediately, and some were almost certainly taken, because slave-taking was built into the Viking economy. Now zoom out. This was not random savagery. It was a business model with blades. The National Museum of Denmark states plainly that slaves and thralls were among the most important commodities traded by Vikings, acquired especially on expeditions to the British Isles and Eastern Europe. Some were used in households, fields, and construction. Some were sold in trading centers like Hedeby, and women's bodies were exposed to sexual exploitation. So imagine the beach after the killing. Smoke lifting from timber, metal cups scattered in sand. A novice, or a servant, or a pilgrim, or a widow attached to the monastery watching strangers step over the dead. What does a mind do first? Not theology, not history. Distance, exit, waterline. Who can run? Who is injured? Which man is looking at me? Survival begins as math, and terror begins when the answer arrives. You are being watched, not as a person, but as stock. Here is where great retention lives in the shift from massacre to inventory. Because once the viewer realizes the worst scene was not the attack but what came after it, the story deepens. The competitor senses this and pivots early, which is smart. But then it over-explains with invented rituals, unsupported names, and repetitive suffering beats. Our version fixes that by staying inside the strongest psychological engine, uncertainty. Not knowing whether you will be killed, sold, separated, or forced to adapt is more gripping than a single exaggerated claim. Picture the loading process. Hands bound with whatever is available. A shove, Wet ankles on cold wood. Someone too old to move quickly struck aside. Someone young kept alive. A child screaming for a mother already lost in the smoke. Do you understand why captivity shatters the mind so fast? Because the rules change every minute. 1 second you are prey worth grabbing, the next you are property worth preserving. Mercy and cruelty become impossible to distinguish. The sea crossing would have been its own form of violence. Not because we need to invent theatrical horrors, but because transport itself destroys identity. Dark hole, little room, salt on cracked lips, the smell of fish, vomit, damp rope, urine. No idea where north ends. No idea if landfall means rescue or resale. And above you, men laughing in a language you cannot read on their faces yet. Would they kill you when you arrived? Would they sell you? Would you ever hear your own language again? This is where the body makes its bargain. First comes resistance, then calculation, then silence. Psychologists today would call it adaptation under extreme powerlessness. Your mind narrows to immediate tasks. Breathe when the hold closes. Swallow when food appears. Do not draw attention. Watch the other captives. Learn which footsteps mean danger. Heroic fantasies die early in captivity. Routine is what keeps people alive. And if that sounds modern, it should. Because the mechanisms are modern. Strip people of certainty. Control food, movement, sleep, and information. Force dependence. Punish unpredictably. Soon the prisoner begins organizing life around the captor's moods. That isn't weakness. That is the nervous system trying to survive. How many people watching this believe they know what courage looks like? Would courage still look noble in a dark hull after 3 days without knowing if you are cargo or sacrifice? When these captives reached Scandinavia, their fates likely split. Some were folded into rural households. Some sold onward through trade networks. Some made to labor in textile work, farms, kitchens, or childcare. Some, especially women, existed under the constant threat or reality of sexual ownership. This is not guesswork pulled from sensational fiction. It aligns with broader evidence for Viking slavery, female captives, and the long-distance trade in human beings. Now the question becomes even darker. What did the women of Lindisfarne lose first? Freedom, obviously. But not only freedom. They lost witnesses. At the monastery, suffering had a community. Someone knew your name. Someone could say you belonged. In captivity, grief becomes private, a prayer whispered where nobody answers. A language nobody around you values. A memory nobody benefits from keeping alive. And once no one records you, history begins helping the captor. That is the real violence of the archive. The competitor video knows this instinctively and tries to exploit it with, "The church erased them." That line is powerful because it creates betrayal from both sides. Pagan violence first, institutional silence second. But it overstates the conspiracy. The deeper truth is more disturbing. The archive did not need a coordinated cover-up. It was built by men who wrote about saints, kings, relics, and battles. Enslaved women were not the center of the page, so they fell off it. Think about that for a moment. A golden reliquary gets described. A bishop's letter survives. A monastery's grief becomes literature. But the missing woman? She is converted into labor before she can become memory. If she lives, she vanishes into someone else's household. If she bears children, those children may never know the name she had before the raid. If she dies, the grave may say nothing about where she came from. What is more terrifying than pain? Pain that leaves almost no paperwork, and yet traces remain. History.com points to DNA research on Iceland suggesting that a large share of the island's founding women had Gaelic origins, while more men were Nordic. Strong evidence that many women came from the British Isles through capture, coercion, or forced movement. That does not prove a specific Lindisfarne captive ended in Iceland, but it proves the larger pattern. Women from these islands were taken north and folded into Norse worlds. So imagine year 2, not the raid, not the ship. Year 2. Because shock is loud, but endurance is quiet. You wake in a longhouse to smoke trapped under the roof beams. You know which floorboard creaks. You know which child cries before dawn. You know how to keep your eyes down when certain men enter. Maybe you grind grain. Maybe you twist wool into thread. Maybe you lift water in winter until your hands split. Maybe the wife watches you with contempt. Maybe with pity. Maybe both. This is where simplistic storytelling usually weakens. It wants villains to remain cartoonishly loud, but real domination often becomes domestic, routine, normalized. The blow everyone fears is not always the one that lands. Sometimes the worst thing is discovering that the house can function around your suffering. People still eat, children still laugh, the dog still sleeps by the hearth. Your terror becomes background noise in somebody else's ordinary life. Is there anything more chilling than cruelty becoming furniture? And there is another reason women mattered in this system: skill. Textile production was high-value work in the Viking world, and women's labor could be economically crucial. Captive women were not only vulnerable bodies, they were productive assets. Some may have brought agricultural knowledge, domestic labor, healing knowledge, or literacy uncommon in parts of the wider population. That combination, reproductive control plus economic utility, made female captives especially valuable, which means the true horror is not just brutality, it is efficiency. A raid is chaos. Slavery is administration. Someone decides who is strong enough to keep. Someone decides who can be sold. Someone decides whose child counts and whose doesn't. Someone decides that a person who once prayed in one world now scrubs floors in another. The axe is terrible. The ledger is worse, because the axe kills once. The system keeps harvesting. Could some captives have resisted spiritually? Of course. Could some have hidden prayers, remembered feast days, or taught children fragments of old belief? Very likely. Human beings smuggle identity in whispers, in recipes, in lullabies, in the way they cross themselves when nobody sees. The problem is not that these things never happened. The problem is that sensational scripts often pretend to know the exact scene, exact names, exact speeches. They trade historical ambiguity for fake certainty. We will not do that here. What we can say is this: Christian slaves were visible enough in Viking trade centers that one account describes a monk so shocked by seeing Christian slaves for sale in Hidevi that he sold his possessions to buy their freedom. That single detail opens an entire moral abyss. By 870, the traffic was open enough to be witnessed in a market. If Christian captives from the British Isles could reach Hidevi, then Lindisfarne was not an isolated tragedy. It was an opening note in a much larger machine. And that machine kept learning. Monasteries were rich, they were poorly defended, they contained metal, books, portable objects, and people unlikely to meet raiders with shields. So the logic repeated: attack the coast, take the wealth, take the human wealth too, move fast, disappear by sea. By the time inland powers reacted, the horizon was empty. Tell me, how do you defend against men who turn your shoreline into a trapdoor? Now we return to the question from the opening: what happened to the missing women? Here is the answer no clickbait title wants to admit. Most likely nothing dramatic enough for a saga. No single ritual. No theatrical ending. Something worse. Absorption. They were swallowed by everyday slavery. By chores. By childbirth. By resale. By violence too common to be commemorated. By new languages. By households that benefited from never asking who they had been before. That is the climax of this story. Not a throne room, not a heroic rescue. The horror resolves into disappearance. The women taken from Lindisfarne were not remembered because slavery is designed to convert lives into usefulness and then hide the conversion. It erases origin, it renames people, it severs witnesses. It lets later generations inherit bloodlines without inheriting the screen that started them. And once you understand that, the silence of the sources stops feeling accidental. But here is the bitter twist. Silence is not total defeat. Captives change the worlds that consume them. They bring words, habits, beliefs, and memories. Sometimes they raise children inside the very culture that conquered them. Sometimes they outlive masters. Sometimes they become the reason a household begins changing from within. We should not romanticize that. It is not redemption. It is human residue. Even under domination, people leave traces. Centuries later, Scandinavia would Christianize. Not because captive women alone caused it. History is never that neat. But because trade, kingship, politics, missionaries, and human intimacy all pulled the old world in new directions. The competitor is smart to use irony here, but weaker in making violated women the sole engine of conversion. Our stronger frame is broader. The people treated as property still influence the societies that consume them, even if the record rarely gives them credit. Lindisfarne itself did not vanish in one day. The community survived in altered form. St. Cuthbert's cult moved. The memory of the raid spread across Europe like a warning flare. And that too matters for retention and storytelling. The attack feels cinematic because it marks a beginning, not only the Viking Age in the popular imagination, but a new European fear that the sea could suddenly deliver men who did not negotiate with sanctity. What does civilization look like when the horizon itself becomes a threat? Now let's talk thumbnail psychology. The competitor's no-text approach likely works only if the image carries immediate emotional clarity. A terrified woman, a Viking silhouette, a religious symbol under threat, strong contrast, and one dominant question. No text can raise curiosity by forcing the brain to complete the narrative, but it also risks ambiguity on mobile. The better version for the historian fact is one human face, one clear aggressor cue, one sacred symbol, and one visual contradiction, not dead, taken. That creates the curiosity gap in half a second. And let's talk drop-offs. A viewer is most likely to leave in 4 places. First, after the initial shock if the script stalls into slow geography. Second, during long exposition about Norse society that feels like homework. Third, during repetitive cruelty that stops escalating. Fourth, near the end if the story resolves into vague moralizing rather than a sharp answer. So we fix all 4, faster setup, shorter explanation bursts, new tension every paragraph, and a climax built around the archive's silence. Not just another list of atrocities, because the real engine of this story is not Vikings were brutal. Most viewers already assume that. The real engine is this: holy places promise safety, records promise memory, both failed. The men at Lindisfarne could not protect the living. The documents that survived could not fully restore the stolen. Once the viewer feels that double betrayal, they stay. Fear brings the click, injustice keeps the watch time. So if you ever wondered why history channels that merely list facts get abandoned while darker documentaries explode, this is why. People do not only want information, they want confrontation. They want the feeling that a locked door has just been opened. They want to look at a famous event and realize the familiar version was the safer version. And the safer version of Lindisfarne ends with dead monks. The harder version begins with the missing. The missing are the story, a shoreline at dusk. No bells now, just surf against stone. Somewhere across that water, a woman taken in 793 is learning the rhythm of a house she never chose. Maybe she is still praying. Maybe she stopped because survival demanded silence. Maybe nobody around her can pronounce the name she once answered to. And maybe years later someone will describe the raid that destroyed her world without ever mentioning where she went. That is how history wounds twice. First it lets violence happen. Then it lets the vulnerable fall out of the sentence. If this is your first time on The Historian Fact, subscribe now. Because this channel does not stop at the famous event. We go after the part history leaves in shadow. Like the missing, like the unnamed. Like the people transformed into footnotes by systems that fed on their silence. Like the records that tell you what was stolen from the altar but not who was stolen from the shore. So what happened to Lindisfarne's women? The most honest answer is also the most unbearable. They were taken into a world built to erase them and use them. Some likely died quickly. Some likely labored for years. Some may have borne children in lands they never wanted to see. Some may have carried fragments of language and faith into Scandinavian homes. Almost none were granted the dignity of a full record. And that is why their story still hurts. Because they were not only attacked, they were made absorbable. Remember that word, absorbable. It is what every predatory system wants human beings to become. Easy to move, easy to rename, easy to profit from, easy to forget. And the reason this story feels modern is simple. Every age creates categories of people it can disappear more comfortably than others. That is not a Viking problem, that is a human one. So the next time you hear Lindisfarne reduced to the day the Vikings killed monks, stop there. That is only the clean version. The dirtier version is about those who were not found among the dead. Those who left no chronicle because a chronicle was the one thing captives never controlled. Those whose lives were spent inside other people's households, other people's children, other people's economies. Those who survived long enough to be forgotten in real time. And maybe that is the final pattern interrupt. The worst fate at Lindisfarne may not have been dying on holy ground. It may have been living long enough for the world to stop looking for you. History remembers the attack. We should remember the disappearance.